When I needed them most, my own family didn't just turn away. They started planning my life without me. I remember the exact moment that thought first crossed my mind, not as a dramatic realization, but as something quiet, almost polite, like a guest knocking softly on a door I wasn't ready to open. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind where the air turns crisp enough to make you reach for a sweater even inside your own home. I had just come back from the hospital 3 days earlier, a minor heart procedure, the doctor called it. Though at 72, nothing feels minor when it comes to your heart. The house still carried that sterile smell from the antiseptic wipes the visiting nurse had used that morning, mixing oddly with the faint scent of cinnamon from a candle I'd forgotten to blow out the night before. I had set the table for 3. Nothing fancy, just grilled chicken, steamed green beans, and the mashed potatoes Daniel used to love when he was a boy. I even used the good plates, the ones with the thin gold rim that my husband Robert and I had bought on our 20th anniversary. I told myself it was just dinner, just a simple way to feel like things were normal again, like I wasn't alone in a house that suddenly felt too large for one person. I checked the time. 6:15 p.m. They were already 15 minutes late. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and glanced at my phone, sitting face up on the counter. No messages. No missed calls. I told myself traffic was probably bad. Daniel lived about 40 minutes away now, out in the newer part of town where everything looked polished and unfamiliar, and Ashley always had something going on, some event, some obligation that seemed more important than anything that had come before it. 6:30 came and went. The mashed potatoes had started to form that thin skin on top, the kind that only appears when food has been sitting too long. I stirred them gently, trying to bring them back to life, as if that small act could somehow fix everything else. I walked into the dining room and looked at the 3 chairs. Mine at the head of the table, Daniel's to my right, Ashley's across from me. I could almost see them there, like a memory layered over the present. Daniel laughing, Ashley smiling that careful, practiced smile of hers. But the chairs stayed empty. The house stayed quiet. At 6:47, my phone finally lit up. I didn't rush to it. I just stood there for a moment, watching the screen glow against the dim kitchen light, as if I already knew that whatever was on it wouldn't feel right. When I picked it up, it was a text from Daniel. "Hey Mom, something came up. We won't make it tonight. Rain check." That was it. No explanation. No apology that meant anything. Just a sentence that felt like it had been copied and pasted from somewhere else. I read it twice. Then a third time. My thumb hovered over the screen, as if I might respond, as if there was something I could say that would make this feel less final. But I didn't type anything. I just set the phone back down on the counter, exactly where it had been before. The chicken cooled. The candle flickered. And for the first time since I came home from the hospital, I felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. Not even anger. Just a quiet, steady awareness. I had spent my whole life believing that when things got hard, family would come closer. That when I needed them most, they would be there without question. But standing alone in that kitchen, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by outside, I realized something else entirely. They weren't coming. And somewhere deep down, I began to understand that this wasn't just about a missed dinner. The house felt different the next morning, not louder or quieter, just emptier in a way I could not quite explain, as if something invisible had been removed overnight and I was the only one who noticed it was gone. I woke up earlier than usual, sometime around 5:30, long before the sun had fully risen, and for a moment I forgot everything. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand, thinking about nothing at all. Then it came back to me, not as a sharp pain, but as a slow, steady weight settling over my chest. The dinner, the empty chairs, the message. I sat up carefully, still mindful of the doctor's instructions, and reached for the glass of water beside my bed. It tasted faintly metallic, like it had been sitting there too long, which it had. I had not touched it the night before. I moved through the house slowly, almost deliberately, as if I were walking through someone else's life. The dishes from dinner were still in the sink, exactly where I had left them. The plates with the gold rims were stacked neatly, untouched except for the food that had gone cold hours earlier. I turned on the faucet and watched the water run over them, steam rising into the quiet kitchen. The sound filled the space, but it did not make it feel any less empty. After I finished, I dried each plate carefully and placed them back in the cabinet, one by one, the way I always had. Routine had always been my anchor. It gave structure to days that might otherwise drift apart. But that morning, even the routine felt different, like it was something I was performing rather than something I belonged to. Around 7:15, I made myself a cup of coffee. I added just a splash of cream, the way Robert used to tease me about, saying I never really liked coffee, just the idea of it. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, the one that overlooked the front yard. The maple tree out there had started to turn, the leaves a mix of gold and deep red, catching the early light in a way that almost made the whole scene look warm. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the heat settle into my fingers. I thought about calling Daniel. The thought came and went more than once. I imagined what I would say. I imagined his voice on the other end, distracted, maybe apologetic, maybe not. I imagined Ashley in the background, her tone light, her words carefully chosen, always sounding kind while meaning something else entirely. I set the mug down on the side table without taking a sip. Instead, I reached for my phone. I did not open his message again. I had already read it enough times to know it would not change. My thumb hovered over his name, then moved away. If they wanted to be here, they would have been. That thought settled in quietly, the same way everything else had. Later that morning, the visiting nurse stopped by for a quick check. She asked the usual questions, took my blood pressure, reminded me to take my medication on time. She was kind in a professional way, the kind of kindness that comes from routine rather than connection. When she left, the house returned to its silence almost immediately. I stood in the doorway for a moment after she drove away, watching her car disappear down the street, and I realized that she had been the only person to step inside my home since I came back from the hospital. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law, just someone being paid to be there. I closed the door gently and locked it, more out of habit than necessity. As I walked back into the living room, my eyes fell on a framed photo on the mantel. It was taken about 10 years ago, before everything started to feel complicated. Daniel stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, smiling in a way that looked open and easy. Ashley stood on his other side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her smile just as perfect then as it was now. I picked up the frame and held it for a moment, studying their faces. Back then, I had believed what I saw. Back then, I had not questioned anything. I set the photo back down exactly where it had been and took a slow breath. Something had shifted, and I could not pretend otherwise anymore. This was not just distance. It was not just busy schedules or bad timing. There was a pattern forming, quiet but unmistakable, and for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining it and started asking a different question entirely. Why would they pull away now when I had never needed them more? I started noticing the small things first, the kind of details most people would overlook or explain away without a second thought. But once I saw them, I could not unsee them. It was never one big moment that changed everything, not at the beginning. It was a series of quiet shifts, each one subtle on its own, but together forming something I could no longer ignore. A week before my hospital stay, Daniel had come by to drop off some groceries. He stayed less than 10 minutes. He did not sit down. He did not ask how I was really feeling. He stood near the doorway, checking his watch more than once, as if time spent with me was something he needed to measure carefully. Ashley did not come with him that day. She had sent a message instead, something polite and perfectly worded, saying she hoped I felt better soon and that she had been so overwhelmed lately. I remember reading it twice, noticing how it sounded kind without actually saying anything meaningful at all. That was new. Ashley had always been attentive in the beginning, always present at family dinners, always the one suggesting we celebrate birthdays together or spend holidays as a family. But over the past couple of years, her presence had changed. She was still there, technically, but never fully. Always on her phone, always with somewhere else to be. And somehow, Daniel had followed that same rhythm without realizing it. Then there were the holidays. Last Thanksgiving, they had hosted at their place for the first time. Ashley had insisted it would be easier for everyone. I had offered to help, to bring dishes, to arrive early, and set things up the way I had done for decades. She had smiled and told me to just come and enjoy myself. When I arrived, everything was already done. The table was set in a style that felt more like a magazine spread than a family gathering. There was a place for me, of course, but it was at the far end, slightly removed from the center where the conversations naturally formed. Daniel spent most of the afternoon talking with Ashley's friends, people I had never met, while I sat quietly, listening more than speaking. At one point, I tried to tell a story about a Thanksgiving from when Daniel was little, how he had insisted on helping me cook, and ended up covering the entire kitchen in flour. He smiled politely, but Ashley interrupted halfway through, laughing and saying, "Oh, Daniel was always such a mess, but he has grown out of that now." The conversation moved on without me. It was a small thing. That is what I told myself at the time. Just a small thing. Christmas had been similar. They told me they wanted to keep it low-key, just the two of them this year, something about needing a break after a busy season. I understood, or at least I told myself I did. I spent that Christmas morning alone, making myself a simple breakfast and watching the snow fall outside the window. Later that afternoon, I saw photos online. A full house, a beautifully decorated tree, Ashley standing in the center of it all, smiling, surrounded by people. Daniel beside her, looking comfortable, like he belonged exactly where he was. I stared at those photos longer than I should have, trying to match what I was seeing with what I had been told. That was the first time something inside me truly questioned it. Not just their actions, but the pattern behind them. It was always Ashley organizing things. Ashley deciding who was included and who was not. And Daniel, my son, following along, step by step, without ever seeming to notice what was being left behind. Even the way they spoke to me had changed. Daniel used to call me Mom, in that easy, familiar way, his voice warm, relaxed. Now it sounded different. More formal, more distant, as if he was speaking to someone he respected out of obligation rather than love. Ashley, on the other hand, had perfected a tone that sounded caring on the surface, but underneath it, there was always something else. Something measured. Something calculated. I began to replay conversations in my mind, moments that had felt slightly off at the time, but now seemed clearer. The way she would suggest things that sounded helpful, but always resulted in less space for me. The way she would speak for Daniel, answering questions before he had a chance to respond. The way decisions seemed to be made without ever including me, even when they directly affected my life. Standing there in my living room, looking at that old photo on the mantle, I realized that none of this had happened suddenly. It had been building, piece by piece, over time, quiet enough that I had not wanted to see it. But now, with the house silent around me and the memory of that empty dinner table still fresh in my mind, the pattern was impossible to ignore. This was not distance. This was something intentional. And for the first time, I began to wonder not just what they were doing, but what they were planning. The thought did not leave me after that morning. It stayed with me, quiet but persistent, like a faint sound you cannot quite place but cannot ignore either. And over the next few days, it began to shape the way I looked at everything around me, especially the things I had once taken for granted. I started paying attention in a different way, not with suspicion at first, but with a kind of careful awareness that I had never needed before. On Thursday afternoon, I went into the study, the room Robert had always called his office, though it had slowly become a place where we kept important papers more than anything else. The shelves were lined with old folders, neatly labeled in his handwriting, and the desk still held the same small scratches from years of use. I had not spent much time in there since he passed, not because I could not, but because I had not needed to. Robert had always handled those things. Finances, documents, the quiet, practical side of our life together. But that afternoon, something pulled me toward that room, something steady and undeniable. I sat down at the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside were folders I recognized, property tax records, insurance papers, the mortgage statement that had long since been marked paid in full. I ran my fingers over the edges of the documents, feeling the texture of the paper, grounding myself in something real and familiar. Everything seemed in order at first glance. Nothing missing, nothing obviously wrong. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that something had already started moving without me. I opened another drawer, this one holding more recent paperwork, things that had come in the mail over the past year. That was when I noticed it. A letter from the county office, dated 3 months earlier. It was addressed to both Robert and me, even though Robert had already passed by then. That alone was not unusual. These things take time to update. But there was a note scribbled in the corner, in handwriting that was not mine. A phone number. And next to it, a name I did not recognize. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to place it, trying to remember if it meant anything. It did not. I turned the page over, reading the contents more carefully this time. It mentioned a request for property information. Nothing specific, just a general inquiry. Still, it felt out of place. I set the letter down slowly, my mind already moving ahead, connecting it to the quiet changes I had been noticing, the distance, the conversations that no longer included me, the decisions that seemed to happen somewhere else. That evening, Daniel called. It was the first time he had reached out since the missed dinner. His voice sounded the same at first, polite, measured, asking how I was feeling, whether I was resting enough, whether I needed anything. I answered him the way I always had, calmly, reassuring him that I was fine, that I was taking care of myself. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional, and then he said something that made everything else fall into place. He mentioned the house. Not directly, not in a way that sounded like a demand. He said it gently, almost thoughtfully, as if he had been considering it for some time. He talked about how big it was, how much upkeep it required, how it might be a lot for me to manage on my own now. His words were careful, but the direction was clear. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak, letting the silence between his sentences stretch just enough for me to hear what he was not saying out loud. Ashley's voice drifted faintly in the background at one point, soft, guiding, as if reminding him of something. He continued, suggesting that maybe we could look into options, something smaller, something more manageable, maybe even a community where I would have people around me. I could hear the concern in his tone. Or at least, I could hear the version of concern he wanted me to believe. I thanked him for thinking about me. I told him I would consider it. And then I ended the call before he could say anything more. I sat there for a long time after that, the phone still in my hand, the quiet of the house settling around me once again. It was no longer just a feeling. It was no longer a series of small, disconnected moments. It was a direction, a plan, perhaps not fully formed, but already in motion. And for the first time, I understood that whatever was happening, it had very little to do with my well-being and everything to do with something else entirely. Something they had not yet said out loud. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I picked up the phone and called someone who knew this house long before Daniel or Ashley ever thought of it as anything more than a place to visit. His name was Thomas Green, the attorney who had handled Robert's estate, a man who had sat at this very dining table more than once, going over paperwork while Robert made coffee, and I listened quietly, trusting that everything was being taken care of the way it should be. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar, the kind of voice that did not rush or soften unnecessarily. When I told him my name, there was a brief pause, and then a warmth returned, not exaggerated, just real. He asked how I had been, and for a moment, I almost gave the usual answer, the polite one, the one that keeps everything simple. But instead, I told him the truth, not everything, just enough. I mentioned the letter. I mentioned the phone number I did not recognize. I mentioned that my son had recently started talking about the house in a way that felt premature. There was a silence on the other end, not uncomfortable, but focused. I could hear papers moving, perhaps a pen being picked up. Then he asked me a question that shifted something inside me again. He asked if anyone had contacted the office on my behalf regarding the property. I told him no, not that I was aware of. Another pause. Then he said something carefully, each word placed with intention. He said there had been an inquiry, not a transfer, not a formal request, but an inquiry made about the ownership status of my home. It had come through a third party, someone who claimed to be assisting with future planning. He did not give me the name right away. Instead, he asked if I wanted him to look deeper into it. I said yes. My voice did not shake. It did not rise. It stayed exactly where it had been all morning, calm, steady, as if I were discussing something ordinary. After we ended the call, I set the phone down and walked back into the living room. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor. I noticed things I had not paid attention to before. The edges of the rug. The way the curtains moved just slightly with the air from the vent. Everything felt sharper, clearer, as if a layer had been removed from my vision. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Daniel. This time, his tone was different. More direct. Less careful. He asked if I had given any thought to what he had said the night before. I told him I had. He sounded relieved, just slightly, as if he had been waiting for that answer. He began talking about options again, but this time there were more details. Specific places. A senior community about 20 miles away. A unit that had recently become available. He mentioned amenities. Safety. Convenience. Each word sounded reasonable on its own, but together, they formed something else entirely. I listened without interrupting. I let him finish. Then I asked a simple question. I asked him how long he had been looking into this. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough. He said he had just started thinking about it recently. His voice did not change, but something underneath it did. Something I could hear now that I had not been listening for before. I did not challenge him. I did not point out the inconsistency. I simply thanked him again and told him I would take some time to consider everything. After the call ended, I did not move right away. I stood there in the middle of the room, holding the phone, feeling the quiet settle around me once more. But it was not the same quiet as before. It was no longer empty. It was full of understanding. Later that evening, Thomas called back. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice. He gave me the name attached to the inquiry. It was not a stranger. It was not someone distant or unrelated. It was Ashley. He explained that she had reached out through a financial consultant, asking general questions about property transition, about what would be required if ownership were to change under certain circumstances. Nothing illegal, nothing official, just questions. But the kind of questions that only come before something else. I thanked him for telling me. I told him I would be in touch. And when I hung up the phone, I did not feel shocked. I did not feel angry. I felt something much quieter than that. Something clearer. The pieces were no longer scattered. They had come together, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that left no room for doubt. This had not started last week. It had not started with a missed dinner or a single conversation. It had been building, quietly, carefully, step by step. And now, I finally understood what direction it was all moving in. I did not confront them, not then, not when the truth finally settled into place with a clarity I could not ignore, because I understood something that I had not understood before, that reacting too quickly would only give them time to adjust, to soften their approach, to hide what they were already setting into motion. Instead, I did something much simpler. I stayed quiet. The following day, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I made my coffee the same way, sat in the same chair by the window, watched the same stretch of street where nothing ever seemed to happen. But inside, everything had shifted. I was no longer waiting for them to come back to me. I was watching them instead. That afternoon, Ashley called. It was unusual. She rarely reached out directly unless there was a reason. Her voice was warm, almost overly so, the kind of warmth that feels practiced rather than natural. She asked how I was recovering, whether I was taking my medication, whether I had everything I needed. Each question sounded thoughtful, but there was a rhythm to it, like she was moving through a list rather than speaking from concern. I answered politely, giving her nothing more than what she asked for. Then she moved the conversation exactly where I expected it to go. She mentioned the house. Not in a demanding way, not in a way that could be easily challenged. She framed it as a conversation about my comfort, my safety, my future. She spoke about how difficult it must be for me to manage such a large place alone, how she and Daniel had been worried about me, how they only wanted what was best. I listened without interrupting, letting her words fill the silence between us. Then I agreed. With her. Not fully. Not in a way that gave anything away. Just enough to let her believe that I was beginning to see things from her perspective. I told her she might be right, that the house did feel larger than it used to, that I had been thinking about what the future might look like. I could hear the shift in her tone immediately. A slight easing. A hint of satisfaction she tried to keep hidden, but could not quite conceal. She suggested we all sit down together soon, maybe over dinner, to talk things through. I told her that sounded like a good idea. After the call ended, I set the phone down slowly and allowed myself a moment to sit with what had just happened. It was not the words themselves that mattered. It was how easily she had stepped into that role, how naturally she had positioned herself as someone guiding a decision that was never hers to guide. Later that evening, I went back into the study. This time, I was not just looking. I was organizing. I pulled out every document related to the house, every statement, every piece of paper that confirmed what I already knew but now needed to see laid out clearly in front of me. The deed, the tax records, the documents Robert had signed, the ones that ensured everything would remain in my name. I read through them slowly, carefully, not rushing, not skipping anything. Each page grounded me further, reminding me of what was real and what could not be taken without my consent. I placed everything back in order, but this time, I did not return the folders to the drawer. I kept them on the desk, within reach. Over the next 2 days, the calls became more frequent. Daniel checked in again, this time sounding more optimistic, as if he believed I was already moving in the direction they had planned. Ashley followed up with details, sending me links to properties, describing them in careful detail, painting pictures of a life that seemed smaller, quieter, easier. I responded the same way each time. Calm, agreeable, open. I did not resist. I did not question. And because of that, they stopped hiding. Their suggestions became more direct. Their assumptions more confident. They spoke about timelines, about next steps, about what would need to happen first. They believed they were guiding me toward a decision. What they did not realize was that I had already made one of my own. I would not fight them the way they expected. I would not argue or defend or explain. I would let them continue exactly as they were, thinking they were in control, thinking they understood the situation completely. Because sometimes, the most powerful position is not the one where you speak the loudest. It is the one where you say nothing at all and watch everything unfold exactly as it was meant to. By the end of the week, they had stopped pretending that this was just a conversation and started treating it like a plan that was already in motion. And what struck me most was not what they said, but how naturally they said it, as if my agreement was no longer something they needed to earn, but something they had already secured. Daniel called that Friday evening, his voice lighter than it had been in days, almost relieved, and he told me he had found a place he thought would be perfect for me, a quiet community about 25 miles outside the city, with walking paths, a small clubhouse, and neighbors around my age, as he put it. He described it carefully, painting a picture that sounded pleasant enough, safe, contained, manageable. I listened without interrupting, letting him build the image fully, letting him believe I was stepping into it with him. When he finished, I thanked him, and I told him it sounded nice. There was a pause on the line, the kind that follows confirmation, and I could almost hear him exhale. He said he could schedule a visit, maybe early next week, just to take a look. I agreed, not because I intended to go, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to take this. The next morning, Ashley sent me a message with links and photos, each one carefully selected, each one showing bright rooms, clean spaces, smiling people who looked like they had accepted something long before I ever would. She added a short note, saying she thought I would love it there, that it would be a fresh start, something easier, something better. I read her message once, then again, and then I set the phone down without responding right away. Instead, I walked into the study and sat at the desk, the same place where everything had first begun to make sense. The documents were still there, exactly where I had left them, and I opened them again, not because I needed to check them, but because I wanted to remind myself of what was real. This house was not just a place. It was a life built over decades, every corner shaped by choices that Daniel had been too young to remember and Ashley had never been part of. It was mine, not by accident, not by convenience, but by intention, written clearly in ink that did not fade just because someone else had plans. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it, steady, certain. Later that afternoon, I called Thomas again. This time, I did not ask questions. I gave instructions. I asked him to review everything, to make sure there were no vulnerabilities, no gaps, nothing that could be used without my knowledge. He listened carefully, asked a few precise questions, and then assured me he would take care of it. His tone did not change, but there was a quiet understanding in it now, as if he knew this was no longer about simple curiosity. When I hung up, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not yet, but clarity. That evening, Daniel and Ashley came by unannounced. It was the first time they had stepped into the house since I returned from the hospital. Ashley walked in first, her eyes moving quickly across the room, taking in details, measuring something I could not see but could feel. Daniel followed behind her, smiling, asking how I was, his tone warm but slightly rushed, as if there was an agenda waiting just beneath the surface. I invited them in, offered them coffee, moved through the motions the way I always had, calm, composed, welcoming. We sat in the living room, and for a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, a new restaurant they had tried. Then, Almost seamlessly, the conversation shifted. Ashley brought up the community again, this time with more certainty, more detail, as if she were presenting something already decided. Daniel nodded along, adding small comments, reinforcing the idea, building it piece by piece. I listened. I nodded. I even smiled. And then, when they finished, I said something. Simple. I told them I was open to seeing it, that it might be a good idea to explore options. The change in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable. They relaxed. Their shoulders lowered slightly. Their voices softened. In that moment, they believed they had succeeded. They believed I was moving exactly where they wanted me to go. What they did not see, what they could not see, was that I had already stepped somewhere else entirely, a place where I was no longer reacting to what they were doing, but quietly preparing for what would come next. The meeting was set for Monday morning, and they insisted on coming with me, which told me everything I needed to know without them having to say it out loud, because people who are simply helping do not need to be present for every step unless they are trying to guide the outcome. Daniel offered to drive, saying it would be easier for me, that I should not be worrying about directions or traffic, especially after everything I had been through. I agreed. Again, not because I needed the help, but because I wanted to see how far they believed they were in control. The drive was quiet at first. Ashley sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally turning back to me with a smile that felt practiced, asking if I was comfortable, if the temperature was right, if I needed anything. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but I could see the tension in the way his fingers tightened slightly whenever Ashley spoke, as if he was following cues he did not even realize he was receiving. The community was exactly as they had described. Clean, quiet, carefully maintained. The buildings were arranged in neat rows, the lawns trimmed perfectly, the sidewalks free of even a single crack. It looked less like a place people chose and more like a place people ended up. A woman in her early 50s greeted us at the entrance, her smile warm, her tone professional. She introduced herself as a coordinator and began walking us through the space, pointing out features, highlighting conveniences, describing a life that was smaller, simpler, contained. Ashley asked questions before I could. Daniel nodded at all the right moments. I listened. I observed. I took in everything, not just what was being shown, but how they reacted to it. When we stepped into one of the available units, Ashley moved ahead of me, walking through the rooms as if she already knew where everything would go. She stood in the kitchen, running her fingers lightly along the counter, commenting on how easy it would be to maintain. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the identical row of homes across the street, saying it felt peaceful. I walked in last. The space was clean, bright, and completely empty. No history, no memory, no trace of anything that had come before. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, and I realized something very simple. This was not about making my life easier. This was about making my absence easier. The coordinator continued speaking, explaining the next steps, the paperwork, the timeline. She mentioned availability, how quickly units like this tended to go, how it would be best to act sooner rather than later if I was interested. Ashley glanced at Daniel, a quick, subtle look that lasted less than a second but said everything. Daniel turned toward me then, his expression open, expectant. He asked what I thought. I did not answer right away. I walked slowly through the space one more time, my hand brushing lightly against the edge of the doorway, grounding myself in the present moment. Then I turned back to them and smiled. I told them it was nice. I told them I could see why they liked it. I told them it might be something worth considering. The reaction was immediate. Relief. Satisfaction. A quiet sense of completion that neither of them tried very hard to hide. The coordinator began discussing paperwork again, more confidently this time, as if a decision had already been made. Ashley stepped closer, asking about deposits, about timelines, about what would be required to secure the unit. Daniel stood beside her, nodding, adding small confirmations. I watched them both carefully, noting how easily they moved into that space, how naturally they spoke as if they were arranging something that belonged to them. When we left, Ashley was already talking about next steps, about what needed to be done first, about how quickly everything could come together. Daniel agreed with her, his voice steady, certain. I sat in the back seat again, looking out the window as the community disappeared behind us, the identical buildings fading into the distance. Neither of them noticed that I had stopped responding. Neither of them noticed that I had said everything they needed to hear already. And neither of them realized that the plan they believed they were finalizing was not the one that would ultimately unfold. 2 days later, I invited them over for dinner. Something simple, something familiar, the same way I had done just a week before. Except this time, I knew exactly what I was setting in motion, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to hope they would come, because I already knew they would. They arrived right on time. Not a minute late. Ashley walked in with a small smile, her eyes moving quickly around the room again, as if checking for changes, while Daniel followed behind her carrying a bottle of wine, something he had not done in months. The table was already set. 3 plates. The same gold-rimmed china. The same quiet room that had once felt empty now felt different, not warmer, but clearer, as if everything was finally in its proper place. We sat down, and for a few minutes, the conversation stayed light. Ashley mentioned the community again, casually this time, as if it were already part of our shared understanding. Daniel talked about how quickly we could move forward, how the unit could be secured within days if we acted now. I listened. I nodded. I let them speak until there was nothing left for them to add. Then I reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair before they arrived. I did not rush. I did not make a scene. I simply opened it and slid a few documents across the table toward them. Daniel looked down first, his expression shifting slightly as he read the first page. Ashley leaned in beside him, her smile fading just enough to reveal something else underneath. I watched them both carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet certainty that had taken days to fully form. The documents were clear. Updated ownership confirmations, legal protections, notices that ensured no transfer, no inquiry, no future planning could move forward without my direct and explicit consent. Thomas had done exactly what I had asked. Everything was secured. Everything was documented. Everything was mine. The room went quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that fills every corner, leaving no space for misunderstanding. Daniel looked up at me, his voice slower now, asking what this was. I answered him simply. I told him it was clarity. I told him that I had taken the time to review everything, that I understood the direction things had been moving, and that I had made sure there would be no confusion going forward. Ashley spoke next, her tone still controlled, still careful, but no longer quite as smooth. She said they were only trying to help, that everything they had suggested was for my benefit. I nodded. I told her I understood that was what they wanted me to believe. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not need to. The truth was already sitting between us, printed clearly in black and white. Daniel shifted in his seat, his expression uncertain now, as if he was trying to find the version of the conversation he had expected and could no longer see it. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who had sat at this same table years ago, laughing, asking questions, trusting me without hesitation. Then the moment passed. I closed the folder and placed my hands gently on top of it. I told them I would not be moving. Not now. Not later. I told them this house was not a burden, not something to be managed or reduced or transferred. It was my home, and it would remain that way for as long as I chose. Ashley did not speak again. Daniel opened his mouth once, then closed it, as if he had nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided. We finished dinner quietly after that. No arguments. No raised voices. Just the sound of utensils against plates and the soft hum of the house around us. When they left, they did not linger. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, and I felt something settle into place completely. Not relief. Not victory. Just certainty. They had not lost a house that night. They had lost something they had not even realized they were risking. And I had not fought them. I had simply stopped being someone they could move without consequence.